Thank you, Mr Speaker. Huge amount of fuss and bluster there from a person who had a bit of a cheek in saying that my colleague Wayne Mapp should feel embarrassed about being in this House because he's retiring. Well, I think that Speaker should actually feel very, very embarrassed about being in this House. His electorate voted him out and he's still here. Explain that to your people. Yet he was also, full of criticising the government, That Speaker was a member of a cabinet that cost this country $700 million in a failed purchase of Transrail. That's how smart he is. And then, what did he do? He left us with another $2.5 billion, Mr Hughes, problem in the ACC account. Oh yes, there was a shortfall there. And in 9 years, that man's government, what did he do in the government as a cabinet minister? He increased the public service employees by 50%. What an absolutely appalling cabinet minister you were. Mr Speaker, this Speaker has this evening, followed a long line of other Labor speakers who have, well, yes, they're communists, as Mr Mapp says, but basically their plan for this country is to borrow and hope. That man, his party, his colleagues, they're about borrowing and hope. And as my Prime Minister John Key said 2 days ago, the annual cost of Labor's spending promises is $5 billion and climbing. And a succession of Labor Party speakers, followed by Mr Hughes today, have got into this House, and yet they cannot explain to one person in this country, how are we going to pay? How are we going to pay for this plan? I've got to say, Mr Hughes, your leader spent 7 hours in a beauty salon. Your leader spent 7 hours in a beauty salon over the summer, and that was just to get the estimate for fixing his hair, for colouring it. Every time Phil Goff opens his mouth in this House, he confirms Labor's borrow and hope recipe, but it will add hundreds of millions of dollars to government borrowing. This man, Mr. whatever he is, List MP in Levin, and his leader would saddle New Zealand with more debt to foreigners who'd have to be paid back, guess what, with interest. This is the plan. They borrow more, and then what happens? You get a credit downgrade for New Zealand. What will that do? That will push up interest rates for Kiwi families, it will push up interest rates for business, and it will cost jobs. How dumb is that, Mr Hughes? How dumb is that? In the State of the Nation speech last month, Goff announced a $1.3 billion promise to make the first $5,000 of annual income tax free, including the wealthiest New Zealanders like me, like every person in this House. He wants to give us all a tax cut. It is the most expensive way of providing a benefit in this country. Totally dumb, Mr Hughes. Totally dumb, Mr Goff. While many New Zealand families are careful with their money and paying their own debt, this Labor Party is promising to do the exact opposite. Not with their money, oh no, with taxpayers' money, with your and my money. At least Mr Goff has done New Zealanders a service early in the electoral year. He has contrasted Labor's lack of plan and loose spending, more borrowing and high taxes, with National's responsible plan to bring debt under control and to get this economy growing faster. Darren Hughes lives over the hill for me. My community suffered for 9 long years under Georgina Beyer and Helen Clark. And why are we in a recession now? Because they squandered the good times. They squandered their money in the good times. Why are our businesses in recession? Thank you, Georgina Beyer. Thank you, Helen Clark. Thank you, Cabinet Minister Darren Hughes. You did a wonderful job. I'm afraid the farmers in my electorate and the manufacturers in Dannevirke like East Steel and Metalcraft, or the Fonterra milk powder plant in Paeatua, they need world-class infrastructure to ensure they can compete efficiently and productively on the global market. And I'm really supportive of Minister Joyce and his efforts to ensure our schools in Porongahau and Eketahuna in Puranawa can get on board the broadband train and make the most of this great technology. Minister Joyce has ensured the work which I heard promised by Georgina Bayer for 9 years. Yes, we'll fix the Rimataka Road. What did they deliver with Helen Clark? Nothing. What did Mr Hughes deliver in the Cabinet? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Stephen Joyce has not only fixed the Rimataka Hill Road, as everybody can see when they drive by, but he's also working on the highway between Woodville and Dannevirke in my electorate. Furthermore, he is working very hard to help Kiwi Rail become more competitive, and I know from the Wellington Regional Council that the Wairarapa train service is the most profitable in New Zealand. We're also in our electorate providing help to people with leaky homes. Why? Because what did Labor leave behind? The Wairarapa and Hawke's Bay farmers in my electorate who earn this country's foreign exchange were left after 9 long years of poor governance with a dial-up internet compromised by electric fence interference and no plan. Industry was paid the telecommunications levy for improving rural broadband, but there was no accountability about how it was spent, Mr Speaker. Labor set up a $325 million broadband investment fund, which was all about giving piecemeal grants to operators, not building a solid broadband network. They called for tenders before the 2008 election. Did I see anything come of it in my first term in this House? Not a jot. We're swapping. My Prime Minister, this country's Prime Minister John Key, is swapping a $325 million grant scheme for a $1.8 billion investment. Whether you look at science and innovation, with my good friend here, Wayne Mapp, who has now established a new Ministry of Science and Innovation, which will be a far more effective bridge between science and industry and helping to turn great ideas into export successes. What did he inherit when he became minister in this area? It was a system that was overly complex and bureaucratic, and businesses were not investing enough in research and development. Tax credits were open slather for accountants with no guarantee that the money would get to be used for research. Absolutely, he's onto it. Mr Speaker, we have in this country in the last 12 months through the work efforts of Murray McCulley and my colleague Tim Grosser signed a trade agreement with China which has generated around about $850 million of new exports to China. That is the same as finding a market the size of Indonesia. And who does that help? It helps every farmer. Labor started it. Well, Labor didn't finish it, did they? And then if you think about the effort, I was particularly pleased to be on the Government Select Committee that dealt with the Rugby World Cup legislation, because as we've seen in the last 2 months in the Wairarapa, the air show run by Tom Williams brought in about $8 million to our area. The La-di-Da concert brought in huge amounts of money and saved the Masterton South area from total devastation over the summer period. And the Rugby World Cup will do the same for the Wairarapa when we host the Georgian team. Mr Speaker, this government has a plan. It is to increase the accountability and the efficiency of the bureaucracy. It is to grow the economy. It is to promote exports, and it is to get rid of waste. Mr Speaker, I can also say to you that this afternoon I've heard a lot of comments from the opposition about cutting childcare education. I can tell you that that budget has actually been increased by $400 million, not cut, and that yes, while there are some readjustments, we're trying to help the people at the bottom of the pile, not the top. And I can tell you in my electorate, less than 40%, fewer than 40% of childcare centres are actually impacted by that change. And when I've written about it in my paper, well, I can tell you it has got strong community support. I've only had complimentary comments, except from 2 people in the Labor Party who are busy writing to the local newspapers on that issue. Mr Speaker, this government has got a plan, and this plan is going to be implemented over the next 6 years. Thank you.